Okay, yeah, also a hello from my side, and welcome to the first talk. It's about digital accessibility, but it's not a talk that goes like in depth into a specific part of accessibility, but more like in breadth. So I'm covering a bunch of topics. I'm also giving like a short intro into accessibility and also into disabilities. And yeah, those are the topics I'm going to cover. My name is Fynn Ellie. I work as a front-end developer here at Factorial. And this on the left was me last year in the Hamburg harbor in front of the Arctic Sunrise, the Greenpeace ship. And yeah, go support your local climate activist group. It's more important than ever. Without further ado, let's get into it. The web is for everyone. You may have heard this quote by Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who basically invented the World Wide Web. And everyone, of course, also includes disabled people. And so that's what we are going to talk about. But to understand what accessibility and disabilities mean, we have to talk about barriers and the distinction between disabilities and barriers. That's related to the so-called social model and the medical model of disabilities. And first we have people who have disabilities. That's like an intrinsic thing. I, as a disabled person, have a disability. And on the other hand, we have society, which creates barriers. That's like an extrinsic thing. And accessibility focus on the right part, removing barriers. And that's the social model of accessibility. We don't approach disabilities in a medical sense, but in a social sense. And that is an important distinction. Accessibility focuses on the right part. And to give you an overview about disabilities, because we often hear about like blind people, that's like the most obvious disability out there. But there are actually a bunch of categories we may not have thought about. So let's go into a few categories. Physical disabilities, everything that has to do with mobility, like think wheelchair user, or dexterity, what can I do with my hands? But also chronic illnesses, a criminally underrated disability. Sensory disabilities are these like commonly known disabilities like blindness or deafness. Speech disorder, don't underestimate speech disorders. That's about language learning. Aphasia is something where the brain is damaged, so you can't create sounds anymore. Mental disorders, ADHD, you've probably heard about that, thought disorders, but also personality disorders. Then developmental disabilities, dyslexia, probably most commonly known in this category, which is about reading and writing, but dyscalculia, that's for maths. So back in school, when the teachers told you just get better at maths, maybe you've had dyscalculia. And dyspraxia is a learning disability for everything that has to do with physical movement. So, for example, tying your shoelaces. And intellectual disabilities, emotional, behavioral disorders, cognitive impairments, but also dementia. So what we can see here is like a bunch of things that are like sometimes related, sometimes not related. So disabilities come in a wide variety of shapes and forms, and people don't necessarily fall into one category. A lot of people have more than one disability. So these categories are more like to give you a guideline of what's out there, but these are not hard set categories. So then let's talk about barriers on the other hand. So we've had disabilities, barriers. The physical world is a good example for barriers. Here we have a sidewalk and then a crosswalk across a street. And if you look at the sidewalk, you can see it's not lowered. So if someone tries to get down there with, for example, a wheelchair, or maybe even someone with a baby stroller, it will be a bumpy ride. And also a blind person doesn't even know that there's a crosswalk because there's no guidance system for them. So they wouldn't even know that they can get across the street safely here. So how do we remove these barriers? We improve the architecture. So we can lower the curb. That's called curb cut. And so people who need a level crossing can get down there. And these white stones, you can see them all across cities. That's so-called tactile paving. They have like round dots and stripes, and they are there for guiding blind people. So next time you walk across the city, maybe look out for these kinds of barriers on the one hand, and also the measures that are taken to remove these barriers. So this is a great example for how we remove barriers. We don't try to remove the disabilities. Getting back to the digital world, that's why we are probably all here. So missing alternative text, for example. So you have an image on your web page, it doesn't have alternative text. So people who can't see the image don't know what it's about. Also, a thing is unstructured text. So if you have just a long paragraph of text without any structures, no headings whatsoever, people who can't see the text, they don't know how the text is structured. Then videos without captions. So if you have deaf people, they don't necessarily understand what the video is about because they can't hear the sound. The same goes for podcasts. If a podcast doesn't have an audio transcript, then you can't understand what's in the podcast as a deaf person. And language, complex language is also a big topic, especially if you're going into public sector, government websites. It's all about reducing language complexity so people with learning disabilities are able to understand the text. Then an important topic is also performance. So a lot of disabled people are marginalized on multiple accounts. So of course they have the disabilities, but often they don't get high-paying jobs, so they can't afford devices that are powerful enough to load modern websites, which is a shame, to be honest. And last but not least, low color contrast. So you can also experience that. Just put your notebook out into the sun and you probably can't read anything anymore because it's just a big glare of sunlight. So that's also something to look out for. So yeah, these are just a bunch of examples. This is just a starting point. There are tons more digital barriers out there, but this is just an idea of what you can look out for. So you might think accessibility, it's probably like kind of a niche topic. When you go through the streets, most people don't look disabled. But if we look at the statistics, that's definitely not the case. The EU collects statistics from all member countries, and about 101 million people in the EU have a disability or at least one disability, which is about 1 in 4 people. So it is a huge topic, and it's more important than ever with recent legislation changes, so we will look into those later on. This is also important. We are all just temporarily abled. Even if we don't have a disability yet, we will surely get one at some point. Everyone is getting older, and maybe you have grandparents. You probably had grandparents at least. So everyone is getting there at some point. And to better understand this, Microsoft created a really great chart. They called it the persona spectrum, which has different levels of disability on the one side, and then some examples on the other. And so we have permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. For everything touch-based, permanent, of course, means, for example, an amputee doesn't have an arm or misses a leg. That's permanent, can't really do anything about that. Temporary things, like a broken arm, we might not see that as a disability, but it surely is one. And situational would be, for example, a parent with a child on their arm. And for seeing, would be blind, would be permanent, and eye damage can be something temporary, hopefully. And yeah, situational, people who text and drive, don't do that, that's really dangerous. For hearing, deaf would be permanent. An ear infection, you might have already had something like that, would be a temporary disability, and a loud environment would be something situational. And for speaking, non-verbal, permanent. Laryngitis is an infection in the throat, temporary, and all people who work in an international environment might have witnessed that accents, so non-native English speakers and also sometimes native English speakers can have a heavy accent that's hard to understand. So that would be situational. So how do we deal with this as disabled people? That's where assistive technology comes in. And assistive technology is not here to remove disabilities, it's here to deal with barriers. And in the digital world, we have a bunch of different kinds of assistive technology. And I'm giving you a few examples, so you have like an overview for everything that has to do with senses, so seeing, hearing. We have most common example, a screen reader which reads out loud content from the computer. A braille display is a sort of keyboard for braille characters, which is really a cool device. But also something really trivial like zooming in stuff is really helpful. And for hearing, again, the most basic thing, crank the volume up louder volume control is a sort of assistive technology. Hearing aids are more advanced, and captions for videos are also really important. A lot of operating systems these days also provide automatic captions, which is a nice stopgap solution in case captions aren't provided by the content. This is an example for a keyboard for someone with visual impairment. It has like really large letters, high contrast between the background and the foreground. And this is a braille display. By the way, these devices are incredibly expensive. Like you pay 1,000 euros for something like this. So this is an issue with a lot of hardware-based assistive technology. It's usually quite expensive. For physical disabilities, we have something like voice control, talking to your computer, for example, keyboard shortcuts, keyboard mouse, so controlling the mouse with the keyboard, and the other way around, controlling the keyboard with the mouse. And hardware-based things, switches like big buttons you can press if you have mobility impairments or trackballs. Eye tracking, you may remember Stephen Hawking and his speech computer, which was powered by eye tracking. And smart home devices are also a kind of assistive technology. This is a great project by Microsoft. They created these Xbox adaptive controllers, so people with mobility impairments can enjoy video games, which is really cool. And this is a trackball, looks like ancient technology, but it's like helpful if you don't have movement with your arm, you can just move the mouse with your fingers. Okay, so, and how do we cater for all these assistive technologies? And that is where the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines come in. And they are abbreviated to WCAG or WCAG sometimes, and these are, of course, guidelines for accessible web content. It's a document published by the W3C, and it's one of the most popular standards for web accessibility. And the great thing about it is it's basically a long checklist. So you can go through it, and it has very clear instructions of what to do to make your stuff accessible. And it caters to a large variety of disabilities. It's by no means perfect, but it's a very good starting point. And the current version is WCAG 2.2. If you are like into web development, you may have heard of WCAG 3, but that's like very early stages. So we have 2.2 for now, and that's the thing we are probably stuck with for a long time. If you want to dig into the WCAG, I propose starting with the understanding docs, because they are written in a more approachable language, one might say in a more accessible language. And the WCAG is structured into 4 big categories called the PUR principles. So we have perceivable as the first category. Content needs to be perceived with at least one sense. Which one is not important, but one sense has to be able to perceive the content. O stands for operable, so you have to operate the content with some device. So maybe your keyboard, maybe a mouse, speech control, stuff like that. U stands for understandable, so content needs to be understandable, language needs to be approachable, accessible. And R, robust, so technical compatibility with assistive technology. Those are the PUR principles. And WCAG, each test criterion has a certain level of conformance. So at the very foundation, we have level A. That's like baseline. That doesn't make a website accessible. It's just a starting point for the important stuff, which is level AA. This is also required by law, which we will look into in a second. And if you want to put like the cherry on top, you go to AAA, but that goes into territory where not every content can achieve this level. So then you have to go into alternative content. So think, for example, an infographic. It's really hard to make an infographic fully accessible, so you might have to provide a content alternative for that. Which brings us to the legislation, the last part. So in the EU, we have 2 laws which are important for web developers. First is the Web Accessibility Directive. That is about the public sector, so everything that has to do with governments. And it's a bit older, so it requires WCAG 2.0. In Germany, you might have heard of it. It's the Barrierefreie Informationstechnikverordnung, also called BITV. And this is in effect since 2016. So theoretically, all government public sector websites have to be accessible. They aren't, but they should, or they must. But more interesting is the European Accessibility Act. This is accessibility for the private sector. So basically all, with some exceptions, websites by the private sector that provide content for end users have to be accessible according to WCAG 2.1. It will be updated to 2.2 probably later this year. And there's a deadline, June this year, 2025. And that's why everyone is kind of up in arms in the accessibility world at the moment. So, I want to leave you with a quote by Dr. Ashley Shue, who wrote the very fantastic book Against Techno-Ableism. And in the beginning of the book, she wrote, "Many of our problems are social, structural, and practical problems that stem from the idea that disabled people are fundamentally flawed, unworthy of inclusion, broken, or inadequate. This is ableist thinking." So this is something to keep in mind. There's a bunch of legislation and stuff like that, but in the end, what we are doing is we want to create a web and a world in general for disabled people where we don't try to fix them, but we try to fix the world, basically. So yeah, don't try to fix disabled people. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to take a look at the slides, they are available online, where I also put a bunch of links to the resources I've shared. And if you have any questions, then feel free to ask.
Just one question, how many clients, you're working for clients, right?
Yes.
Are actually asking for accessibility and...
So it's getting a lot more now that we have the legislation. So it depends. So if you have clients who do like more stuff for the public good, they have been interested in this for a very long time. And now that it's in the law, basically everyone is interested. But we also see that there's a lot of educational work we have to do. A lot of people haven't really had any like touch points with this whole topic. So yeah, it's just getting started.
So and then it's level AA?
Yes, level AA is required by law.
Okay, and then that also means that you have all this hardware here to test?
No. So you don't really need the hardware. Mm-hmm. You can test with stuff that's on your computer. So it's mostly fine to test with a screen reader. That's also one of the biggest assistive technologies. So if you have a Mac computer, you can use voice over the integrated screen reader, which is like free for use. On Windows you have narrator. So that's usually fine for testing.
Thank you.
How much extra work is it? So if I would start a new project, if you would go percentage-wise, would it be 20%, 50% extra work to implement this kind of process?
So if you're an experienced front-end developer in the field of accessibility, it's not really that much extra work, maybe a couple of percent. If you have to learn it first, of course, it takes a lot more time, but it doesn't really add that much. So if you do it from the beginning, that's the important part. If you try to retroactively make a website accessible, that can take the time it probably takes to rebuild everything from scratch, depending on how bad it is. Any more questions? Yeah.
You already said, talked about using VoiceOver as a tool to test for accessibilities. Do you use other tools, or is it just going by the checklist basically, or are there tools that you use to check for certain things? I know Lighthouse has some tests, but I'm not sure how.
So you can start with automated tools like Google Lighthouse, or X has also a test suite. Those are a great starting point to check for things that can be automatically tested for, which is about 20 to 30% of accessibility issues. And everything after that is basically manual testing. So yeah, it's a great starting point. If you use the Google Chrome web browser, there's Lighthouse in the dev tools. Definitely use that. And then the real work starts after that.
I just looked it up while you was giving the talk. The Web3C has actually a list of evaluation tools that is really long, and there might be some things to automate much more.
Yeah. So the W3C has a lot of great resources to get into this topic. So of course they have the understanding docs, which are really comprehensive. They also give you examples how to do manual testing. So that's why the understanding docs are so helpful to get into this. And then lists of tools.
Yeah. So you mentioned infographics.
Just
out of curiosity, how do you make them accessible?
So It depends. It depends on the infographics. So we've had elections in Germany recently, so those are a lot of charts, bar charts, pie charts, stuff like that. So in that case, a lot of the time it's easier to provide an alternative like a table. Tables are really great for accessibility. The way they are structured really helps people with screen readers, for example. So in cases like these, it might be the easier way to just say, okay, my main infographic might not be accessible, but I have an alternative. And that's perfectly valid. You can have something that is inaccessible as long as you provide an alternative. So yeah, if you have like these infographics which are like really long, you know, this scrolly telling stuff, in these cases it might also be easier to provide a written alternative, for example.
I was wondering about the alt tag.
Yep.
What if you have, let's say you grab your pictures from an API and let's say you want to sell, it's a site about selling cars and the API gives you one picture. Maybe it's a view from the outside where you see the car and landscape. Maybe it can also be a view from the inside. So how would you, so you don't know what you write in your alt tag. So I was wondering what's the current state of browser technology or tooling that can help you with post-polluting these alt tags? Because it's annoying to write alt tags, right? No one likes this.
Yeah.
So is there clever ways, clever tools that help you with that?
Not really.
Yeah, okay.
So you can use stuff like ChatGPT to get an okay description of the contents of the image, but the problem is these tools which like automatically detect content in an image, they lack context. They don't know how you are using the image. So you might use an image in two completely different contexts, so they might require slightly different descriptions, and that's why it's so annoying and a really manual process.
So, yeah, I was thinking actually if vision impaired people, if they actually already have the tooling we are not aware of, so
Yes.
they have maybe better alt text than we actually type as developers because we are lazy and
Yeah, so there are definitely tools out there that use image recognition that are used by visually impaired people as like a fallback solution. Mm-hmm. So they first check, is there alternative text, and if yes, then that is preferred because it's usually better when it's manually set. But more sophisticated screen readers, they include automatic image descriptions. Yeah. There are also browser plugins for browsers who do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then Fynn, once again, thank you very much, and let's take like a 5-minute break. Thank you.